Subject is British space science fiction in the 1950s that influenced the first generation of British space engineers. Do we start with Dan Dare?
No, what we should do is set a background because,
Okay.
as I said, it's evident when you look at the way the British Interplanetary Society changed after the war. Everything changed with World War II because suddenly you had two things, provable things that could go into space, V2s, and atomic power. So it's no accident that pictures of V2-like spaceships landing, standing on the moon, powered by atomic engines, single stage to the moon, with atomic power, appeared in science fiction. What was it? Across the space? No, the Willy Lee thing, and then followed up. And there was there was a huge amount of stuff. As I was a kid in the 40s, late between the war and 1950, there was a lot of stuff around, but it wasn't in any coherent places you could look and point to quite a lot. There probably wasn't there was a lot of science fiction magazines being published, but I wasn't aware of them. They were in print. But in comics and things, space was a theme, and it was always there on things. In fact, my interest in space came. My father bought me a children's book, a children's annual, which you gave to children at Christmas. Must have been around 47, 48. I was probably about 6 or 7. And it was a picture of the moon in the sky and a picture and a whole crowd and a big spaceship, which is actually exactly a V2 ship on a ramp. So there's an anomaly with a door in it and people going in, and the ship was obviously huge, about the size of an ocean line, but it looked like a V2 on a ramp. And it was a picture of people going to the moon. And that things like that come out of the blue and stick with you. So I was primed. And I wonder if people even in the Eagle Society remember this, but around about 1950, I was there for 9. I was 8 or 9. I was born in October 41. I'm just trying to think which it was. Doesn't matter. But I was pretty young, but nevertheless pretty clued up on space. And I think my dad read the Express, and he turned over a page. I was looking, and suddenly there was a picture of space, a serial with spacemen in it, and it says "Boys, a great new cartoon weekly," and that was an advert for Eagle. Now that's how I knew that Eagle was going to come out. Nobody else told me. I just knew it was. I've described this issue of the Express to people and nobody remembers it, but definitely it was that triggered me. Accordingly, I got on my bike, because as kids you could wander around in those days without protection, cycled down to the paper shop, which involved a considerable journey across a park. We lived at this time in a flat in a big house in the top of the hill in Ealing. I sort of got to Hillcrest Park to what is now Hanger Lane Corner, and there was a newspaper shop there, and I bought the first copy of Eagle for 3p, and absolute King's ransom. I don't know where I got the money from. I probably had very small amounts of pocket money. Are you all right? We've lost another light. Okay, I'll carry on. So I came back. I must have read the print off that, and in fact I bought every issue and read it to death. I clearly was doing everything I could to earn money to pay it. I did a paper round. I remember the pay for that was probably that was after we moved to Linfield Road, so that must have been very late 40s, but I was still pretty young, just trying to guess the time. No, it must have been slightly after that, very early 50s. So late 40s, we were still at the Hillcrest Road. Why I'm saying that is I remember where I bought it. But So after we moved, so I must have been around about, in order to afford things like Eagle, it must have been my mother giving me the money. I did a paper round, which I got 10 and 6. And when you consider Eagle was 3p, that was good. And it went up pretty rapidly to 4 and halfpenny. And everybody else can calculate that. I can do it all in my head, pounds, shillings and pence. So it blew me away, absolutely. No other way. And in fact, not even just down there, but the whole layout of the thing. And the fact that there was in the centrefold a dissected modern thing, like a train, aircraft, something, you know, with a cutaway diagram showing you how they worked, which was brilliant. Everything about it was a classy, and it was a classy magazine, and it was unique. It was set up to be classy, and it was meant to beat the rather scrubby American comics that were finding their way in. And as everybody knows, down there, I've got some early drawings because I've known members of the Eagle Society, and I've subscribed to various things, and I've got some books or things showing the early attempts by Frank Hampson to do down there, and he was originally going to be a space priest, by the way. Going to be a padre.
One of the many aims of Eagle was to convert and strengthen good, honest Christianity.
Absolutely.
Didn't work with you, did it?
No, it didn't. I don't know whether it worked with Alan or any of the other engineers. Oh, it did. I would find it difficult not to.
Because it always had
to be
a Bible story in
oh
the
yes.
cartoon.
No, I know. I learned a lot about the Bible from that. I think I can't remember. It might have been Paul. St. Paul, the first thing that was always on the back page. Frank Hampson did those as well, at least I think he did. Doesn't matter. The point was, the first adventure was the one people always know because he introduced characters that people associate with Dan Dare and Eagle. But quite funnily enough, I was already wanting real stuff enough to kind of reject the continuous emphasis on Treens and the Mekon and all that. The first serial, it was brilliant when they were first introduced. And just to show you how socialist the world was, down there, the Earth is overpopulated and underfed. And the idea was that they would go to Venus to find food for Earth. That was the basic plan, and everybody was eating food blocks and everything like that. So Dan Dare was a member of the British Space Fleet. He was colonel, Brady colonel, pedigree. His father had been a spaceman before him, and Frank Hampson deliberately set them within the century because he didn't want it to set it in the 21st century where we now are, because he thought that would be too far ahead for kids to relate to. So I imagined it being around about, 1980, 1990, was that sort of time. And the first serial was brilliant. They go off and it's a mystery and you were riveted. It followed. And unlike a lot of other serials and things, this story went on for a year and a half. And each week there was a double panel, a front page and the inside front page, all in colour, on Dan Dare and his friends. And you always have to have somebody, but this time Frank Hampson chose a very sensible way of having the person who explains. The person who explains wasn't an idiot at all. The person who explains everything or is responsible isn't an idiot that other people have to explain to in like Destination Moon. First of all, it's a her, and secondly, she's a professor and she knows more than all of them. So they're always asking her what's going on, and she is explaining what the score is. So she actually tells you, Professor Peabody. And it contained everything I could ever want, because even by then I'd had this strange yearning about the future. I always wanted, I don't know whether it was bombed out craters in London when I was holding onto my mother's hands and wanting to be somewhere a little bit cleaner, and the pictures of science fiction futures that were in the papers and magazines occasionally.
Certainly the vision of Hampson, which showed you visions of London and
all in a very Art Deco style.
Yeah.
by the way, which was modern. I still think when I go to an underground station that I'm in the future, because they're in London, a lot of them are Art Deco designs, and they look to me like ultra modern even now. Because to kids, I must ask Alan what he thinks, my son, because it's quite different. So that's the context. But I wanted to explain that Eagle didn't come out of a vacuum. There was a vast amount of space stuff, particularly in the United States. Loads of comics and things, space all the time, and TV serials and everything. And because they were all a bit on the trashy side, that was one of the motives for making Eagle superior. But you have to remember they were also at this time indigenous British science fiction magazines. Now, I hadn't actually got round to reading fiction. In fact, I was such an idealist, awful little head in the clouds kid that I thought there was no point in reading fiction because it was made up. So it was pointless. So I didn't really take to it until I discovered actual science fiction could work. And Dan Dare was one of them. In fact, what there was a magazine called New Worlds, and another one called Nebula, and a third one called Authentic Science Fiction. There were 3 monthly science fiction magazines. Now, my dad, I think, was thinking of retiring from the police. He never made it. He emigrated to New Zealand, joined the Forestry Commission in the early 60s. But in the 50s, he did go and have a look for a job in Ealing Broadway, which was at Corgi Books. And he came home, they gave him a big pile of Corgi books. And they happened to contain Arthur Clarke's City in the Stars, which blew me away so badly. I mean, I must have been, I can't remember what it was published, 54, 55, but it was brand new. It was straight off the press. So I was only about 12 or 13, and I made a point when any adolescent kid should be given a copy of The City and the Stars, because it contains that kind of yearning for the future and strangeness. And in fact, I've only because I'm so lazy, Mark, but I long intended to call that house Diaspar and this one Liss. You see, so to have the names above each one. Anyway, just going back, so they were symptomatic of all these books, and there were things like loads of things. Ray Bradbury, Ray Bradbury short stories, several collections of those, all sorts of stuff. Eric Frank Russell, Men, Martians and Machines, that blew my mind away. Very interesting book. Loads of science fiction books I got stuck into. So therefore, we're talking 54, 55 here. I started reading science fiction because I was working, delivering papers in the paper shop. They also sold New Worlds and Nebula and the science fiction magazines. Now, New Worlds was just stories, but I didn't know it at the time. But of course, it was edited by Ted Carnell, who was a previous secretary of the BIS. He also did a companion magazine called Science Fantasy. And that was bi-monthly, but they were all these contain stories by all the people who ultimately become my friends: Ted Tubb, John Brunner, Harry Harrison, Brian Aldiss. Even I eventually became regular drinking companions with certainly Harry, certainly Ted, and very certainly John. In New Worlds was advertised 2 things. There was the London Circle Science Fiction Club and the British Interplanetary Society, and I think Ted just put them in for nothing, were both advertised in New Worlds. So this this was a marvellous period right up to 57. So from 46 to 57 was the most marvellous period, and I was at the right age and at the right time, because anything was possible. when Sputnik 1 was launched, it immediately limited everything to rather boring things, you know. And that's why I've never been that enthralled by history of Apollo and everything else. I imagined much more than that. I thought I'd be skiing on Mars by 1980, as I keep saying. 1990, let's be realistic. And so on and so on. But in that period, up to 57, when it blew, Hollywood went berserk and produced fantastic science fiction films for a start, starting with Destination Moon and The Thing, and you know, all these early ones. You know, particularly the first 5 years of the 1950s were second to none. And against that background, within Britain, there was all these science fiction magazines which had been going from during the 40s. They were there. I wasn't reading them.
And the radio show Voyage to Space.
Yeah, you're thinking Journey into Space.
Yes.
Yeah, that held me spellbound as well. But don't forget, I was already reading Eagle, so I discovered Eagle. I cycled down the road, got Eagle, blew my mind away. First one, sets the scene for the solar system. Venus is hot, dead right. It had a flame belt round it, not far off. But there were two hemispheres. There was the goodies on one hemisphere and the baddies, the Therons, who were white, blonde, very strange, kind of European looking, and the Treens, who were green and more kind of German helmets. It was quite interesting. Anyway,
we should point out in down there, every single planet and moon in the solar system
is inhabited, absolutely, by all sorts of creatures, are obviously adapted for their environment. And there was no, I'd like to point out very strongly that there was no reason not to believe Venus could be inhabited. Though, in fact, nearly all the stories I read were about a steamy jungle Venus, because all people could see were the clouds. They didn't realise it was a runaway effect, and it was done. But Mars could have been inhabitable as well, you know, and everybody. And Frank Hampson got it right, because Jupiter and all that, and Saturn particularly, it's not Saturn itself, it's the moons of Saturn that are inhabited. So it's all perfectly good and very realistic for its time. However, certain things I always had thoughts about but never took for granted. For example, as myself, I've discussed this with Alan, I think the one key thing to make the story work is everybody has to stand upright on the spaceship and not float about. So you have gravity motors under the decks. And I would say, as a guess, that is the last thing the human race will ever develop. Will be, in hundreds of years' time. Prophets are always wrong, as Arthur Clarke says. But so I'm hoping I'm getting it work. But basically, that's just wishful thinking. But nevertheless,
the good thing is, though, that when we have discovered it, it's the last thing that breaks on the spaceship.
Absolutely, they're all still standing. Yeah, quite happily. And by the way, when they take off, they're lying prone with a video screen, rather like a bomb aimer. And the front of the Earth ships, which go up, look exactly like a B-29 front end.
Yeah,
they're really good. And then so everything. So we get to the end of that one, and then I was happy with that. And quite happy to live with that. But the one that blew my mind really away is another wistful one, which is the next one, which is the Red Moon Mystery. And what the Red Moon Mystery is, sometime millions of years ago, a planet somewhere in the galaxy had bee-like creatures, quite big, sort of this sort of size, that developed quite advanced powers and could actually fly into space. He never quite got where that was, but they could project themselves somehow, and they had learnt how to communally steer their planet through the galaxy. Now, once you've accepted those two impossible ideas, the rest of the story is fantastic and realistic, because they exhausted their planet, so they're interstellar raiders, and they arrive outside a planet. They travel for hundreds of years between the stars, and then when they reach a target system, they circulate a planet, and then they swarm down like big locusts, strip the planet bare, and go back out. Now that I really took to that for many reasons. First,
you'd think that storyline would be used again, wouldn't you? And again. But it's the touches of it. Dan Dare's uncle Ivor is on Mars excavating the ruins that look like Egyptian pharaonic ruins, but that's why not? And there was this civilization on Mars which apparently was wiped out because the Red Moon has visited the solar system before and took Mars out earlier and finished there. So, but Uncle Ivor doesn't know how to read these. He can't see what it is. But eventually they learn how to read the script plates. There's a few tricks I won't go into here about ultraviolet light and things. But he managed to read the script, and they explain and what a warning, because with his dying breaths, this last ruler of Mars had tried to write a warning, And in the meantime, the action starts in the Astoria Hotel on one of the polar caps of Mars, and it's a ski resort. And that's what fixed me forever. I thought, right, skiing on Mars by 1990. And we were all set for that because it went at breakneck pace. There was this marvellous period, therefore, I'll come back to Destination Moon. So the main periods are 45 to 57, where anything was possible in the imagination. There is then a period from 57 to 69, which is very inventive. There's a lot of things happen, and certainly space flight is all over the place. Things like Star Trek and that all start up. And then in the real world, what happened, and everything, and then man lands, the human race make it to another planet, the moon. After that, nothing. The Cold War target has been achieved, switched off, nothing. Okay, you can talk about the shuttle, you can talk about all sorts of progress, you can talk about fantastic progress in astronomy and everything else, and interplanetary probes, but basically human exploration, we should have been skiing on Mars by 1990, and it never happened. So my life has been 50 years of disappointment from then on. So what really, sorry, I must go back because you asked me to deal with it. So in the early part of the 50s, what hammered it really home was Journey into Space. And I was just deeply affected by that, but perhaps didn't follow it because I had Eagle, I had lots of other stuff. I was reading science fiction actively by say the mid 50s, and certainly Journey into Space, which started, was tremendous. Used to rush home, make sure I could listen to it on the radio, and the stories are fascinating as well. And well done and followed through and well executed. I believe it was Ken Gatland was the advisor on those, and they really come right, particularly the space stuff and the rocket ships, and the sound effects made that serial. You can actually hear the thing. You can hear the rocket start up as the turbines start and everything, and it fires. So the sound effects and everything were very realistic, and there was these weird sounds they had which sounded realistic, like the radar scanner and everything. Brilliant. I won't go into the stories themselves. As I said, they're good. Everybody should read them. But I think, therefore, I think you got the picture, Mark. Yeah.
What I'm aiming to get at is that those three periods. I think I actually stopped reading Eagle in the 60s, although I've since bought my copies. Were actually, by the way, read to a frazzle, and my mother must have put them in the dustbin at some point because I was horrified at that. But I saw In Exchange a Martyr set in the 60s.
and bought some anal retentive doctor who must have folded them and had kept them all and then sold them. So I bought that set, and it was 10 times better than my set. So I've got a complete set of eagles, all the annuals, a lot of the side dish, a lot of the other stuff, and I only wish. And I forgot to mention certainly how well organised and how it's never going to happen like that. But as a kid, and that's why, Mark, I always criticise people like you and Alan for actually believing, but I forgive you, because in Eagle I believed that you could have a world government that was responsible and actually made decisions and did things, and clearly it's utterly impossible, but that's another part of the fantasy. At least it's not as bad as gravity motors anyway.
Right.